June 14, 1944. 30,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, coordinates 15°12'N, 1°45°42'E. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, ace pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service with 47 confirmed victories, lead pilot of the Tainan Air Group, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, adjusted his oxygen mask and squinted through the plexiglass canopy of his captured F6F Hellcat. The unfamiliar American machine felt heavy beneath his hands, sluggish compared to the graceful Zero he'd flown for 3 years of war. The American fighter is brutishly simple, Genda transmitted to his wingman in heavily accented Japanese, disdain evident in every syllable. Like their people, no refinement, no elegance, just crude metal and brute force. Through the cockpit glass, the Hellcat's massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine blocked most of his forward view during climbs. The controls required what felt like impossible amounts of force compared to his Zero's feather-light touch. The roll rate was ponderous. The Americans had built a truck where the Japanese had crafted a sword. To Japanese pilots accustomed to the Zero's supernatural agility, a fighter that could turn inside anything in the sky, climb like a homesick angel, and respond to the slightest pressure on the stick, this American machine appeared almost laughably overbuilt. Armored, heavy, slow to respond. A peasant's weapon, what? Genda didn't know. What none of the Japanese test pilots at the captured aircraft facility on Saipan could have imagined was that they were witnessing the fighter that would systematically destroy Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force. Within 12 months, these objects of derision would transform from curiosities into instruments of terror that would sweep the remaining Zeros from the Pacific sky with mathematical efficiency. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded in those 650 caliber machine guns, 2,400 rounds, 15 pounds per second of projectiles, armor-piercing incendiary rounds that could rip through 75 millimeters of steel plate at 200 yards. A fire rate so dense that tracer streams looked like solid bars of light, and the Americans were building them, not in dozens but in thousands. The defeat had begun on December 7, 1941, in the skies above Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Genda himself had helped plan that attack, leading Zero fighters that carved through American defenses like they didn't exist. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero represented the pinnacle of Japanese aircraft design, 6,164 pounds empty, powered by a 940 horsepower Nakajima Sakai engine, armed with two 20mm cannons and two 7.7-meter machine guns. It could outmaneuver anything in the Allied inventory. Its 39-foot wingspan gave it a turning radius that defied Western aerodynamic assumptions. At 15,000 feet, it could execute a 180-degree reversal in 13 seconds. No American fighter could follow that maneuver without stalling and spinning. The Tainan Air Group had swept across the Pacific in those first glorious months. Wake Island fell. The Philippines collapsed. Singapore surrendered. Ceylon was raided. From December 1941 through May 1942, Japanese naval aviation compiled victory ratios approaching 12-1 against Allied fighters. American pilots in their F4F Wildcats, underpowered, slow-climbing, poorly armed, died in droves. The British sent Hurricanes that burned like torches. The Dutch flew obsolete Brewster Buffaloes. The Japanese pilots called flying lighters, for how quickly they ignited. Japanese propaganda proclaimed the spiritual and technical superiority of their pilots and aircraft. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, wrote in April 1942, "American pilots lack Bushido spirit. Their machines are inferior. They flee from combat or die. The Zero is invincible in the hands of properly trained warriors. The Americans build for comfort and safety, weaknesses that ensure defeat." The statistics supported his confidence. Through mid-1942, Zeros had destroyed more than 1,500 Allied aircraft, while losing fewer than 100 of their own to enemy fighters. Japanese aces like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Genda himself had victory tallies that dwarfed their American counterparts. The Zero's range, 1,940 miles with drop tank, allowed strike missions no other fighter could execute. Its service ceiling exceeded 38,000 feet. It represented total Japanese air superiority. But American carrier task forces faced an urgent tactical problem by mid-1942. The F4F Wildcat, while tough and reliable, simply couldn't match the Zero's performance. At 7,952 pounds loaded, the Wildcat was heavy for its 200 horsepower engine. It could barely exceed 300 miles per hour in level flight. Its climb rate was anemic. Most critically, attempting to turn with a zero was suicidal. Wildcat pilots learned to fight in pairs, using diving attacks and disengaging before the zero could bring its superior maneuverability to bear. It was defensive flying, surviving rather than dominating. The casualty numbers told the story. In the Coral Sea engagement, May 1942, American fighters achieved rough parity only by accepting horrific losses. At Midway 1 month later, VF3 and VF6 combined lost 13 Wildcats to claim 17 zeros. Acceptable in the context of sinking 4 Japanese carriers, catastrophic as a sustainable exchange rate. The Navy calculated that at current loss rates they would run out of trained carrier pilots before Japan exhausted its pilot reserves. Something had to change. 3 existing solutions had failed. The F4U Corsair, with its massive 2,000 horsepower engine and distinctive inverted gull wings, was proving nearly impossible to land safely on carriers. Its long nose blocked the pilot's view of the deck. It bounced on landing. It had a tendency to snap into vicious spins. Between July and December 1942, the Corsair killed more Navy pilots in landing accidents than the Zero had shot down in combat. The Bell P-39 Airacobra, despite its innovative mid-engine design, was worthless above 15,000 feet where its engine couldn't breathe. The British tried shipping Supermarine Spitfires to Pacific carriers, but the Spitfire's delicate construction and liquid-cooled engine made it unsuitable for carrier operations. Salt spray corroded components. Rough landings broke airframes. Deck crews couldn't service them. Captain John S. Thatch, commanding VF-3, described the desperate situation in a June 1942 letter to the Bureau of Aeronautics. "We need a fighter that can climb with the Zero, dive away from it, take punishment, and kill it reliably when we get guns on target. The Wildcat does 2 of those 4. That's not enough. Our boys are dying because we're asking them to fight a superior machine with guts alone. Guts aren't sufficient when the enemy has both skill and better equipment." The strategic imperative was absolute. Operation Cartwheel, the planned counteroffensive through the Solomons, required air superiority. The eventual invasion of the Philippines would be impossible without fighter superiority over the invasion beaches. The Navy needed a zero killer immediately, not in 1944 or 1945. Lives measured the cost of delay. The solution emerged from Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, Long Island in late 1941. Leroy Grumman, 47-year-old engineer and company founder, graduate of Cornell's Sibley School of Mechanical Engineering, designer of the Navy's previous generation of carrier fighters, received specifications from Bureau of Aeronautics in October 1941 that seemed almost impossible to fulfill simultaneously. The Navy wanted a carrier fighter that could outclimb the Zero, outdive it, absorb battle damage that would destroy 3 Zeros, carry twice the ammunition of a Wildcat, achieve 375 miles per hour at 17,500 feet, operate from escort carriers whose decks were barely 500 feet long, and be producible in massive quantities by factories employing workers who'd never seen an aircraft 6 months earlier. It will be the heaviest single-engine fighter ever operated from carriers, Grumman admitted to his engineering team in November 1941. Everything conventional wisdom tells us about carrier aviation says this is impossible. We're going to do it anyway. The revolutionary design choice was to stop apologizing for weight and make it work for you. Previous designers had tried to match the Zero's lightness. Grumman went the opposite direction. If American industry could build massive radial engines producing 2,000 horsepower, why not build the airframe around that power? If you had that much power, you could carry armor plate that would stop 20mm cannon shells. You could carry 650 caliber machine guns instead of 4 or 2. You could build the wings strong enough to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs and still pull high-G maneuvers. The trade-off was accepting mediocre turn performance. But if you had enough speed, enough climb rate, enough firepower, and enough protection, you didn't need to turn with the enemy. You could fight on your terms. Key innovations emerged from the engineering team's calculations. The wings would fold hydraulically for carrier storage, not the manual folding of previous designs, but power-assisted folding that 2 deck crewmen could complete in 30 seconds. The landing gear would be the strongest ever fitted to a carrier aircraft, capable of absorbing carrier landings at sink rates that would break a Wildcat's gear. The cockpit would sit high on the fuselage, giving the pilot excellent visibility during carrier approaches. The engine cowling would be modular. Damage could be repaired by replacing entire sections rather than time-consuming sheet metal work. The fuel tanks would be self-sealing, containing layers of rubber that automatically plugged bullet holes. The trade-off accepted was turn performance. At 12,140 pounds combat loaded, nearly 60% heavier than a Zero, the Grumman design would never outturn a Japanese fighter. It would outpower it instead. Prototype F6F first flew on June 26, 1942, from Grumman's Bethpage facility. Test pilot Robert Hall advanced the throttle on the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800, double Wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower driving a 13-foot Hamilton standard propeller, and felt acceleration that seemed impossible for something this heavy. The Hellcat lifted off after a shockingly short deck run. Initial climb rate exceeded 3,500 feet per minute. At 16,000 feet, Hall pushed into a high-speed dive and watched the airspeed indicator climb past 400 miles per hour. The airframe remained rock-steady. No flutter, no control stiffening. He pulled a 6G recovery and felt the wings flex but hold. "It flies like it weighs half what the scales say," Hall reported to Grumman's engineers after landing. "The power is incredible. You point the nose up and the horizon just falls away below you. I don't know how it'll fight, but I know nothing's going to outrun it or outclimb it." The hidden advantage was the turbo supercharger system, essentially an exhaust-driven air compressor that maintained sea-level air pressure at high altitude. At 25,000 feet, where Zero started gasping for air, the Hellcat's engine still produced 1-600 horsepower. It could chase enemy fighters into the stratosphere and still have power to spare. The mathematics of altitude performance would prove devastating to an enemy that relied on climbing away from trouble. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, commanding VF-6 aboard USS Enterprise, initially despised the F6F when the first production models arrived in January 1943. O'Hare, Medal of Honor recipient for his defense of USS Lexington against Japanese bombers in February 1942, test pilot with 3,000 hours in carrier fighters, had mastered the Wildcat's quirks and learned to kill Zeros by exploiting the few advantages the Wildcat possessed. Now the Navy wanted him to transition to this enormous, unfamiliar machine. Training disasters validated his concerns. VF-9, the first squadron to transition to Hellcats, lost 7 pilots and 8 aircraft between February and April 1943 before deploying to combat. The F6F killed more American pilots in training accidents than Zeros would shoot down in VF-9's first 3 months of combat operations. The problems were systematic and terrifying. The aircraft ground-looped viciously if you touched the brakes unevenly during landing. Roll out that massive engine torque would flip you onto your back before you could react. It torque rolled on takeoff if you didn't anticipate the right rudder requirement, full right rudder, or the Hellcat would snap left into the deck or water. It dove like an anvil in spins, recover immediately or it would accelerate past redline airspeed and shed its wings. Pilots accustomed to the Wildcat's docile handling characteristics found the Hellcat intimidating, powerful, and occasionally murderous. But those who mastered it discovered something extraordinary. Ensign Alexander Vrațiu, 22-year-old son of Romanian immigrants from East Chicago, Indiana, recent graduate of DePauw University, future record-setting ace with 19 victories, experienced his first flight in an F6F on March 15, 1943. "I opened up to full throttle on the catapult shot, and it felt like someone had kicked me in the spine." Vrațiu later recalled in a 1982 interview. "The acceleration was violent. Coming off the deck, I could point the nose up at what felt like 45 degrees and still have airspeed increasing. I got to 15,000 feet in 4 minutes. Then I tried the guns. I squeezed the trigger for 1 second, just 1 second, and watched my tracer stream. It looked like a solid bar of light. I thought, this thing is a killer. If I can get guns on a Zero for 2 seconds, that Zero is going to die." The first combat encounters in July and August 1943 confirmed every Japanese prejudice. VF-9 off USS Essex met Zeros from the 204th Air Group over the Solomon Islands in multiple engagements. The F6F couldn't turn with the Zero. Pilots who tried died quickly, just like Wildcat pilots had. It couldn't climb with a Zero in a sustained vertical climb. The Japanese fighter's light wing loading gave it better instantaneous climb performance. It couldn't match the Zero's low-speed maneuverability. At speeds below 200 miles per hour, the Zero could loop, roll, and reverse direction like a hummingbird while the Hellcat wallowed. Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeo Tanemizu, veteran pilot of the 204th Air Group, 23 victories, reported after the August 15th engagement over Vella La Vella. The new Grumman fighter is merely a heavier Wildcat. Fast in the dive, yes, but it climbs like a truck carrying bricks. We can outturn it at will. When they attempt to engage in maneuvering combat, we destroy them. I shot down 2 in one mission. Both pilots made the mistake of trying to follow my turn. Their aircraft shuddered on the edge of a stall while my Zero was still responsive. They died confused, wondering why their vaunted new fighter failed them. In their first month of operations, VF-9 lost 11 Hellcats in combat for only 23 confirmed Zero kills. The exchange ratio was better than the Wildcat had achieved, but nowhere near the dominance the Navy had expected. The British Royal Navy observers aboard USS Essex quietly suggested Americans reconsider the type. RAF pilots, accustomed to sea fires and sea hurricanes, joked that the Hellcat was what you got when you asked an engineer to build a fighter, and forgot to mention it needed to be agile. Built like a bloody lorry, one British observer noted. Drives like one too. But something strange was happening that Japanese intelligence failed to notice in their victory reports. American Hellcats were absorbing incredible punishment before falling. Damage that would disintegrate a Zero merely wounded a Hellcat. One F6F from VF-5 returned from an August 27th mission over Kahili Airfield with 72 documented bullet and cannon shell holes. 5 20mm shells had exploded against the armor plate behind the pilot's seat, armor that didn't exist on any Japanese fighter. The engine had taken direct hits from 7.7mm rounds that punctured cylinders. Control cables were partially severed. The tail section looked like Swiss cheese. Yet the aircraft had flown 140 miles back to USS Yorktown and landed safely. Lieutenant Charlie Ridgway climbed out uninjured. Damage that would have disintegrated a Zero, the flight deck chief reported. The armor stopped what should have been fatal hits. The engine kept running with holes through 3 cylinders. Everything about this airplane is overbuilt. The Japanese are shooting it to pieces and it's still flying. When Hellcats did get on target, the results were catastrophic. The 6M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, each firing 750 rounds per minute, converged at 300 yards to create a cone of destruction that simply erased enemy aircraft. One 2-second burst put 150 rounds into a target area, roughly 6 feet in diameter. Each 50 caliber round weighed 1.7 ounces and traveled 2,900 feet per second. At convergence range, the kinetic energy was equivalent to being hit by a bus, repeatedly 75 times per second. Zeros, built light to maximize maneuverability, had minimal structure. They came apart like paper when that firepower connected. The event that would begin changing Japanese perceptions occurred on September 16, 1943, a Thursday, over Bougainville. Coordinates 6-14 DNS, 155-34E. It involved Lieutenant Hamilton McWarter III, 23 years old, Princeton graduate, VF-12 off USS Saratoga, and an encounter that would become legendary in naval aviation history. McWarter's formation of 6 Hellcats was providing combat air patrol for a photo reconnaissance mission when they were bounced by 14 Zeros from the 253rd Air Group, led by Lieutenant Tetsuzo Iwamoto. 72 confirmed victories, one of Japan's most deadly pilots. The Japanese executed a perfect attack, diving from the sun with overwhelming numerical superiority. They had every advantage: altitude, position, numbers, experience. The Zeros opened fire simultaneously. 14 aircraft, each armed with 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns, created a storm of metal that seemed impossible to survive. McWarter's Hellcat staggered as shells tore through it. 37 X-20mm cannon shells exploded across his aircraft, 7 direct hits, 30 near misses with shrapnel damage. The right wing shattered, losing 3 feet of aileron and wingtip. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit, coating his windscreen in pink fog. The canopy frame was torn away, shredding his maps. Fire erupted from a punctured fuel line between engine and cockpit. McWarter, wounded in his left shoulder and right leg by shrapnel fragments, tried to bail out but discovered the damaged canopy was jammed in the rails. He was trapped in a dying Hellcat at 18,000 feet, with fire spreading toward the cockpit and Japanese fighters circling for another pass. Trapped in a dying aircraft, smoke filling the cockpit, fuel fire burning forward, McWarter later testified at the 1944 analysis board. "I thought I was dead. Couldn't bail. Couldn't see. Could barely breathe. What happened next defied every assumption about combat damage tolerance." McWarter fought the fire by side-slipping the aircraft, using the 200-mile-per-hour wind to blow flames away from the cockpit. The fire burned itself out when it exhausted the leaked fuel. The engine continued running despite having taken direct hits. The R-2800's 18 cylinders provided redundancy. You could lose 3 cylinders and still produce power. The damaged aileron made rolls nearly impossible, but the rudder and elevator still responded. The armor plate had stopped what would have been fatal hits to his seat. The self-sealing fuel tanks had plugged themselves, preventing catastrophic fuel loss. A lone Zero flown by an unknown pilot from the 253rd Air Group discovered the crippled Hellcat limping south at 8,000 feet, trailing smoke. The Japanese pilot, assuming an easy kill, positioned behind McWarter at 200 yards, point-blank range, and opened fire with all weapons. What followed was one of the most extraordinary encounters in aerial combat history. The Zero fired more than 400 rounds of mixed 20mm and 7.7mm ammunition in a sustained 5-second burst. McWarter, unable to maneuver, could only hunch behind his armor plate and pray. The Hellcat absorbed the entire ammunition load. Shells exploded against the armored fuselage section, creating a sound like hammers on a steel drum. Bullets punctured non-critical structures. The tail section accumulated 44 separate hits, yet nothing vital was destroyed. No control cables were severed. The engine kept running. The Hellcat kept flying. The Zero pilot pulled alongside close enough that McWarter could see his face. Young, perhaps 20, expression shifting from confidence to confusion to visible fear. He appeared to be shouting something. Then he pulled up sharply and fled, presumably out of ammunition and disbelieving that his target was still airborne. McWarter's Hellcat landed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. 30 minutes later, with the engine running rough but functional, and control response degraded to barely adequate. He touched down fast, rolled long and ground-looped at the end of the runway when the damaged landing gear collapsed. He climbed out with minor wounds. The aircraft was total wreck. It had brought him home. The crew chief stopped counting holes after documenting 283 separate impact sites. They gave up when they realized distinguishing individual hits from overlapping damage was impossible. The post-flight analysis revealed damage that seemed incompatible with sustained flight. One 20mm shell had exploded 7 inches from McWarter's head, stopped by the armored glass windscreen. Another detonated against the pilot's seat armor plate, creating a crater in the armor but not penetrating. The engine had taken at least 5 direct hits but continued operating on 14 of 18 cylinders. Control cables were shot through but not completely severed. Enough strands remained intact to maintain control authority. 49 of 126 main structural members were damaged, yet the airframe held together. Yet the Hellcat had brought him home. That simple fact, survival under fire that should have been instantly lethal, would reshape both sides' understanding of the Pacific Air War. The survival of McWarter's aircraft sent shockwaves through both naval air forces. American engineers studying the wreckage at Naval Air Station Alameda realized they'd underestimated their own creation. The armor protection was even better than specifications suggested. The structural redundancy exceeded design parameters. The R-2800 engine's ability to run with severe damage was extraordinary. Grumman's philosophy of overbuilding everything was proving its worth in ways the designers hadn't fully anticipated. Japanese intelligence, receiving reports from multiple pilots including Lieutenant Iwamoto himself, initially refused to believe them. No fighter aircraft could absorb that volume of fire and remain airborne. It violated fundamental principles. Fighters were fragile machines where a single 20mm hit could be fatal. Yet testimony from multiple Japanese pilots, including highly credible aces with dozens of victories, confirmed the impossible. The American Grumman was shrugging off damage that would destroy 3 Zeros. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, 204th Air Group commander, wrote in his September 1943 situation report, "The new Grumman fighter represents a fundamental challenge to our tactical doctrine. We have achieved dogfighting superiority through lightweight and agility. The Americans have achieved survival through brute force and armor. When we hit them, they do not die. This changes everything about fighter combat. By November 1943, American pilots were learning to exploit the F6F's true strengths. Commander David McCampbell, commanding VF-15, 34 years old, Alabama native, Naval Academy graduate, had discovered the secret through brutal trial and error, watching men under his command die when they fought Japanese terms. He had survived because he recognized early that the Hellcat was a completely different kind of fighter, requiring completely different tactics. His tactical briefing to VF-15, recorded in the Squadron War Diary, was explicit. Don't turn with them. Don't try to climb with them in a sustained climb. Don't slow down. Use your speed. Use your dive performance. Use your altitude advantage. Get above them. Dive through at high speed. Use your firepower to destroy them in one pass, then extend away using your speed. Climb back to altitude. Repeat. Never, ever try to fight their fight. The approach was called boom and zoom. Use the Hellcat's superior speed, achieved through its massive engine, to dictate engagement terms. Use its superior high-altitude performance to maintain the altitude advantage. Use its devastating firepower to kill in a single pass. Never allow the Zero to exploit its maneuverability advantage. The F6F's weight became a weapon. From 20,000 feet, a Hellcat could roll inverted and pull into a dive that would accelerate it past 400 miles per hour. Faster than any Zero could achieve in level flight. Faster than any Zero could achieve even in a dive. At that speed differential, a Zero couldn't evade. It couldn't turn inside the attack. It could only die. Ensign Vratsu, now flying with VF-6 under Commander O'Hare, developed a variant he called high side slash. Position yourself 5,000 feet above and to the side of the enemy formation. Roll into a 60-degree dive, building speed past 350 miles per hour. Open fire at 400 yards, long range, but your closing speed gives you only 3 seconds until you pass through the formation. Hold the trigger down, walking your fire through the formation. 15 rounds per gun per second, 6 guns 90 rounds per second total. Pull up hard at 6 Gs, using your excess speed to zoom climb back above them before they can react. Lieutenant Junior Grade Kanayoshi Muto, who survived this tactic during the November 11th engagement over Rabaul, described it as utterly different from what Japanese pilots had trained against. They don't fight. They execute. Down from high altitude like lightning bolts. The sound of those 6 machine guns is like fabric tearing. Overwhelming, terrifying. 1 second they're invisible dots above you. Next second your wingman explodes. They're already climbing away before you can react. We can't follow them up, they're faster. We can't catch them. They extend away at speeds we cannot match. We can only die. The true revelation came during November 20th, 1943, Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Tarawa. This mission would demonstrate both limitation and terrifying effectiveness in a single engagement that Japanese survivors would remember as the day the sky caught fire. Commander Edward Outlaw, commanding VF-2 off USS Enterprise, leading a strike package of 24 Hellcats, encountered 31 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers from the 755th Air Group positioning for attack on the American landing craft at 14,000 feet. The Bettys, heavily armed twin-engine bombers designed for torpedo attacks, were Japanese specialized naval strike aircraft optimized to destroy shipping. Each carried a crew of 7 and 1 torpedo capable of sinking a cruiser. They were escorted by 18 Zeros. Outlaw's flight of 8 Hellcats rolled into attack dive from 19,000 feet, leaving the remaining 16 aircraft to engage the Zero escorts. The dive angle was 50 degrees. Speed built past 380 miles per hour. The Bettys couldn't evade. They were committed to their attack run and couldn't maneuver violently with armed torpedoes slung beneath them. Petty Officer Kazuo Sugino, flight engineer in a Betty, who survived only because his aircraft was trailing the formation, later recounted in POW interrogation conducted December 1943. I saw the Grummins diving from above like thrown stones. Impossibly fast. All 6 guns on each aircraft firing. The tracer streams looked solid, like bars of glowing steel connecting them to us. The lead bomber ahead simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated from fuselage. Tail section severed. Crew compartment shredded into metal confetti scattered across 300 meters of sky. It didn't fall. It disintegrated in midair, transformed from aircraft into debris cloud in perhaps 2 seconds. The mathematics were brutal. Each Hellcat carried 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total, weighing 260 pounds. At convergence distance of 300 yards, all 6 guns intersected in a zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything in that zone faced 75 projectiles per second, each traveling 2,900 feet per second, each capable of penetrating 75 millimeters of armor plate. A Betty bomber, built like all Japanese aircraft for range and payload rather than protection, had minimal armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks. The 50 caliber rounds punched through aluminum skin like it wasn't there, detonating fuel tanks, severing control cables, killing crew members, destroying structure. VF-2 destroyed 17 Bettys in the first pass, 4 more on the second pass. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. 19 of 31 Japanese bombers were destroyed, 61% casualties in one engagement. 8 Zeros were shot down trying to defend the bombers. American losses: 1 Hellcat damaged by defensive fire, pilot recovered safely. By January 1944, the Japanese Navy Air Force was discovering another horrifying reality about the Hellcat. It was faster than Zero at every altitude, but the performance gap widened dramatically above 20,000 feet. At 25,000 feet, the F6F was 55 miles per hour faster. At 30,000 feet, the gap exceeded 70 miles per hour. The turbo supercharger that American pilots had initially, distrusted as complex and failure-prone, proved to be a war-winning advantage. Technical explanation: the Pratt & Whitney R2800 supercharger maintained manifold pressure as air thinned with altitude. At 25,000 feet, where atmospheric pressure is roughly half sea level pressure, the Zero's Sakai engine was gasping, producing perhaps 700 of its rated 940 horsepower. The Hellcat's R2800 was still producing 2,600 horsepower. The power-to-weight ratio that determined climb rate, acceleration, and maximum speed shifted decisively in the Hellcat's favor above 20,000 feet. American fighters could patrol at altitudes where Japanese fighters couldn't effectively operate. Lieutenant Kaneyoshi Muto, one of Japan's most successful aces with 28 victories, encountered this reality fatally on February 17, 1944, over Truk Lagoon during Operation Hailstone. Muto's Zero struggled at 26,000 feet, trying to intercept American bombers. His aircraft was sluggish in the thin air, controls mushy, climb rate barely 500 feet per minute. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vretiu, flying his 18th combat mission, caught Muto's Zero from above and behind. Vreitiu's combat report, filed February 18th, was clinical. Opened fire at 400 yards, slight deflection angle, target in level flight. Observed strikes along fuselage immediately forward of cockpit. Fire erupted from engine section. Target snap rolled right and entered vertical dive trailing flames. Observed explosion as target impacted water. No parachute observed. Estimated engagement duration: 3 seconds. Muto's death sent shockwaves through the remaining Japanese naval aviation community. If one of their best, a pilot who had survived 2 years of combat, who had 28 victories, who knew every aerial combat trick, couldn't survive engagement with a Hellcat, what chance did average pilots have? The replacements now entering combat had perhaps 100 hours total flight time. They were being sent to die in a machine that was obsolete against an enemy who had superiority in firepower, protection, speed, altitude performance, training, and industrial production. Japanese High Command ordered an investigation in March 1944. Intelligence officers studied captured Hellcat wreckage, interviewed survivors, compiled performance data. The resulting report, discovered in Japanese archives after the war, made for grim reading. The F6F's service ceiling exceeded 37,000 feet, higher than any Japanese fighter could effectively reach. Its maximum speed approached 380 miles per hour, faster than any Japanese fighter. Its armor package included 212 pounds of steel plate protecting pilot, engine, and fuel tanks from angles spanning 280 degrees. Most disturbingly, its robust construction and redundant systems allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy 3 conventional fighters and still complete its mission. The report concluded, "We have no counter. Production of improved aircraft is years away. Pilot quality is declining as experienced aviators are killed faster than training can replace them. The Americans are achieving aerial supremacy through overwhelming material superiority. In April 1944, a new variant began arriving in the Pacific that would complete the transformation from good to devastating. The F6F featured water injection for the R2800 engine, basically injecting a water-methanol mixture into the cylinders during high-power operations. The mixture cooled the combustion chamber, preventing detonation, allowing higher manifold pressure. The result was an additional 200 horsepower for short periods during combat. The improvement was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Hellcats had adequate climb rate, the F6F could achieve 3,800 feet per minute, matching or exceeding the Zero's climb performance even at low altitude. The acceleration was noticeably improved. The top speed increased to 391 miles per hour at 7,400 feet. Additionally, the F6F introduced zero-length rocket rails, allowing each Hellcat to carry 6 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets in addition to its machine guns, transforming it into a devastating ground attack platform. Lieutenant Commander Genda, the same pilot who had mocked the Hellcat 10 months earlier, encountered the new variants in May 1944 during desperate attempts to defend Saipan. Genda, now flying a worn-out Zero with 600 hours on the engine, faced F6F that seemed impossibly aggressive compared to the cautious Hellcats of 1943. His diary entry, recovered from Saipan after its capture, June 1944, revealed complete reversal. The Grumman we mocked is now the Grumman we fear. They have improved it, new engine, better performance, rockets. How? We struggle to maintain aircraft we have. They improve aircraft that already dominated us. It's psychologically devastating. We cannot win a war against an enemy who manufactures superiority like we manufacture desperation. The F6F created a distinctive howl from its supercharger that could be identified from miles away. Oh, rising scream as the pilot pushed the throttle forward, followed by the hammering of 650 calibers. Japanese ground troops reported being able to identify approaching Hellcats by sound alone 3 minutes before visual contact. They began calling it Whistle of Death for the supercharger scream that preceded attacks. By July 1944, Hellcats equipped with 150-gallon drop tanks could escort strikes deep into Japanese-held territory, beyond 530 miles combat radius. They could fly 700 miles to target, fight for 30 minutes, and return 700 miles to their carriers. Japanese commanders discovered that no base, no airfield, no anchorage was beyond American reach. The standard strike configuration carried 650 caliber machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, 2 1,000-pound bombs or 6 5-inch rockets under the wings, and drop tanks for extended range. Hellcats could sweep Japanese fighters from the sky during the approach, drop bombs on the target, strafe ground targets with their 50 calibers on egress, and still have ammunition remaining for defensive fighting during the return flight. They were fighter-bomber, and close air support aircraft simultaneously. Japanese response was to attempt intercepting American formations during their approach, far from the target, hoping to force them to jettison bombs and fight for survival. But this required climbing to 25,000 feet and maintaining altitude for extended periods, an increasingly impossible proposition for Japanese pilots in worn-out aircraft with inadequate fuel allocations for training. Interception success rates dropped below 15% by summer 1944. Captured Japanese tactical guidance from June 1944 revealed the desperation. Do not engage F6F unless you have altitude advantage. Numerical superiority and perfect positioning. Even then, make one pass and disengage immediately. Extended combat favors the enemy. They have fuel for prolonged fighting. We do not. They have ammunition reserves. We do not. They can absorb damage. We cannot. Survival requires avoiding engagement whenever possible. This was stunningly defeatist language from an Air Force that had dominated Pacific skies just 2 years earlier. As the Pacific War shifted from air superiority battles to supporting amphibious invasions, Hellcats increasingly focused on ground attack missions. The F6F could carry 2 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs, 6 5-inch HVARs each with a 40-pound warhead, or a mix of both. Later variants added centerline racks for 500-pound bombs or napalm canisters. Some F6F were fitted with twin 20mm cannons replacing the inboard 50 calibers, creating 8 gunfighters with devastating anti-aircraft and ground attack capability. Each 5-inch HVAR, high-velocity aircraft rocket, was equivalent to a destroyer's 5-inch gun shell. A single Hellcat could deliver 6 of them, plus 2,400 rounds of .50 caliber, plus 2 1,000-pound bombs. The payload approached 4,000 pounds, equal to some medium bombers. Colonel Takeshi Matsumoto, 37 years old, Imperial Japanese Army, commanding the 14th Independent Mixed Regiment, defending Peleliu during Operation Stalemate 2, September 1944, experienced American carrier aviation attacks firsthand. His account, recorded during post-war interrogation in 1946, conveyed the overwhelming nature of naval air power. They came in waves beginning before dawn. First the fighters, Hellcats, strafing positions we thought were concealed. They flew so low you could see the pilot's face. The sound was terrifying. 6 machine guns screaming, rockets hissing from the rails. Then the hammer of those .50 caliber bullets. A column of our trucks attempting to reposition ammunition simply ceased to exist. 17 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. We were veterans of China Manchuria. We'd never experienced this level of aerial assault. Continuous, precise, overwhelming. The rockets were particularly feared. Unlike bombs, which had to be released from specific altitude and airspeed to hit accurately, rockets could be fired from any angle during a dive or low-altitude pass. Hellcat pilots would roll into a 30-degree dive, aim using the fixed gun sight, fire all 6 rockets in a salvo, then pull out and strafe with .50 calibers. A 4-plane division could put 24 rockets and 9,600 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition into a target area the size of a football field in one pass. June 19, 1944, the day American naval aviators would call the Great Marianas Turkey. Shoot. The Japanese Navy Air Force discovered how completely the balance of power had shifted. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched more than 400 aircraft from their carrier fleet in desperate attempts to destroy American carriers supporting the Marianas invasion. Over 300 Hellcats from 7 American carriers provided combat air patrol coverage for the fleet. The Japanese formations attempting to reach American carriers were massacred. Wave after wave of attackers, Zeros, Judys, Jills, were intercepted by Hellcat divisions directed by radar-equipped fighter directors aboard the carriers. The Americans had every advantage: radar warning, superior aircraft, better trained pilots, numerical superiority, defensive positioning. Japanese aircraft attempting to penetrate the combat air patrol faced 6 to 8 Hellcats per enemy formation. The Hellcats would position above the approaching Japanese strike, dive through at high speed, destroy multiple aircraft per pass, then climb away using their power advantage before the escorts could react. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, flying a Zero with the 6th 1st Air Group, one of only 47 Japanese pilots to return from missions that day, reported in his debriefing, "It wasn't aerial combat, it was slaughter. The Grummins were everywhere, attacking from altitude we couldn't reach at speeds we couldn't match. Our formations were destroyed before we saw American ships. I watched 23 aircraft from my group shot down in 10 minutes. Most pilots had no idea what killed them, just explosions, aircraft disintegrating, comrades dying. I survived by fleeing at wave-top altitude, jettisoning my bombs, abandoning any thought of completing the mission. When you hear those guns, you know death has come calling." By day's end, American pilots claimed 373 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Post-war analysis confirmed at least 315 losses, 75% of the attacking force. American losses, 29 aircraft, primarily to operational accidents rather than combat. 6 Hellcats shot down by Japanese fighters. The exchange ratio was approximately 50 to 1. The final statistics defied comprehension. Grumman produced 12,275 F6F Hellcats between 1942 and 1945. At peak production in 1944, the Bethpage factory completed 1 Hellcat every 38 minutes, 632 aircraft per month. The Grumman facility, built from empty farmland in 1941, was producing more fighter aircraft monthly than Japan's entire industry by war's end. Each Hellcat required 20,000 individual parts, 3.2 miles of electrical wiring, 840 pounds of aluminum, 275 pounds of steel. Yet American workers, many women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision exceeding peacetime standards. Defect rates were below 0.1%. Delivery schedules were met or exceeded every month from January 1943 through war's end. By 1945, the United States was graduating 100,000 pilots annually. Each received minimum 400 hours flight training, including 150 hours in advanced fighters, Hellcats, Corsairs, Mustangs. German pilots were entering combat with less than 80 hours total flight time by war's end. Japanese pilot training had collapsed entirely. New pilots had perhaps 60 hours, barely enough to take off and land safely. Nowhere near enough to survive combat against experienced American aviators. In July 1945, after Japan's surrender, Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the same pilot who had mocked the captured Hellcat in June 1944, the ace who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, who had survived the entire Pacific War and Japan's defeat, was interviewed by U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey investigators on a dusty airfield outside Tokyo. The same pilot who had called the F6F brutishly simple and compared it unfavorably to his beloved Zero. His statement, recorded in USSBS Report 62, deemed too revealing of Japanese deficiencies for public release until 1952, revealed complete transformation of his understanding. The Grumman F6F Hellcat is the best carrier fighter ever built. Its high-altitude performance is unprecedented for a carrier aircraft. Guns that never jam. We experienced continuous jams by 1944 because our manufacturing tolerances had degraded. It carries bombs like a dive bomber, fires rockets like a ground attack aircraft, and fights like a pure fighter when needed. But beyond the machine is what it represents: unlimited American industrial production. You lose 500 aircraft in a month, you build 700 the next month. We lose 50, it's gone forever, we cannot replace them. Your pilots arrive in combat better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, and spare aircraft for advanced flight. We have nothing but courage, and courage without resources is just delayed defeat. We laughed at the Hellcat in 1942, called it heavy and crude. We're not laughing now. When you hear those 650s firing, you know death has come calling. The sound haunts survivors. Mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it's about overwhelming material superiority applied with methodical efficiency. We built the Zero to outfly you. You built the Hellcat to outproduce us, outpower us, outlast us. Your philosophy won. Ours failed. The final statistics defied comprehension. Hellcat pilots were credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter type. An additional 209 aircraft were destroyed by Hellcat rear gunners in the few F6F-3N night fighter variants equipped with radar. Ground strafing and rocket attacks accounted for approximately 1,200 additional aircraft destroyed on the ground. Japanese ships totaling 347,000 tons were sunk by Hellcat bombs, rockets, and strafing attacks. Thousands of trucks, tanks, trains, and installations were destroyed in ground attack missions. Hellcat losses in combat: 270 aircraft to enemy fighters, 172 to anti-aircraft fire. Operational losses from accidents, weather, and carrier landing mishaps added another 537 aircraft. Total combat losses represented 7% of production. 93% of Hellcats built survived the war. The kill ratio in air-to-air combat exceeded 19-1, the highest of any fighter aircraft in any air force during World War II. In 1962, at a reunion of Pacific War veterans in San Diego, former adversaries met in peace. Vice Admiral Minoru Genda, post-war Chief of Staff of the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, architect of Japan's rebuilt Air Force, was asked by an American journalist about his assessment of the F6F Hellcat. Genda's response, published in Naval Aviation News, acknowledged lessons learned at terrible cost. We made fundamental miscalculations in 1941 and 1942. We believed aerial combat was about maneuverability, the ability to outturn, outclimb, outfight individual opponents. We built the Zero to dominate that kind of fighting, and it did. But you Americans understood something we didn't. Modern war isn't about individual combat. It's about systems, production, training infrastructure, logistical sustainability. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed to destroy Japanese naval aviation as an institution, and it succeeded completely. When we saw the first Hellcats in 1943, we thought they were inferior to our Zero. By 1944, we understood they were superior in every measure that mattered. Firepower, Protection, pilot survival, production numbers, operational tempo. By 1945, we had no pilots left who remembered when we dominated. The Hellcat, supported by American industry and training systems, had killed everyone who'd flown in 1941. We laughed at it initially because we didn't understand what we were facing. Not just a fighter aircraft, but the industrial might of America focused on a single purpose. Once we understood that, we knew we couldn't win. The numbers didn't lie. The F6F Hellcat represented more than engineering excellence or tactical superiority. It embodied American industrial philosophy. Build it tough. Build it simple enough for rapid mass production. Build it in quantities that overwhelm any qualitative advantage the enemy might achieve. The Germans had spent the war building Tigers and Panthers and King Tigers, tanks that couldn't be defeated one-on-one. The Americans built Shermans by the tens of thousands that made individual superiority irrelevant. Japanese had laughed at the Hellcat in June 1944 when Genda first flew the captured example. By August 1945, there were no Japanese naval pilots left with enough experience to laugh. Most were dead, killed by Hellcats and Corsairs that had swept Japanese aviation from the Pacific sky with mathematical efficiency. The thunder of .650 caliber machine guns had spoken, and the sky belonged to America.